Okay, guess what? We're still here. That's right. We're still existing. It's another day. And you're listening to Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. I want to welcome you. I want to express some gratitude that you would take this time to be tuning in. So thanks. How's it going? I don't know about you, but this week was rough. I had a rough week. Some stuff's personal. I can't even talk about it. Other stuff's just big stuff. I mean, seems like the take from the poor to give to the rich tax cut's going to pass. Net neutrality's gone. The rhetoric is ratcheted up around going to war with North Korea. California's burning. I got friends who've lost everything they owned in crazy biblical fires in California. It's not good. It's not good. Maybe I'm just watching too much news. But I don't know. Seems like we're at some kind of boiling point. Shit's spilling over. I've been feeling, I don't know, a little bit messed up maybe. In some ways, I mean, I'm fine. Everything's okay. But I don't know. Also, I put out that blog last week and I was talking about this shift in the expectations of people who go to yoga classes. And I've been thinking about another shift that has happened that's kind of on the other side of it. That's more, I think, for the people who are like listening to this podcast. It's on the teacher's side, not the expectation of the students, but that we are in a new paradigm, or we're at least way more in the new paradigm than we were. Like, I don't know if any of you remember, I had Carol Horton on this podcast, and I know she listens sometime. And if you're listening right now, what's up, Carol? But when she was on the podcast, she talked about this paradigm shift cycle, and I feel like that shift has like happened. Like, it seems to me that there are teachers now, probably many listening to this right now, who have never known this world that I talk about, of gurus and people coming up and doing these like harsh adjustments without asking, and chanting and incense in every class. Like, they don't know that. Like, the people who are coming into being teachers now, they've never known that. That doesn't even exist. They only know the yoga that exists in our current sort of state. And from that perspective, there's kind of new rules. There's new ground rules. You know, consent cards and respecting people's pronoun choices. This is, I really think, the new world. And I don't know, we really need to, those of us, and I'm including myself, who still have one foot in the old paradigm, we're going to have to embrace change. And you know, today's talk with Barbara Benagh is kind of to that, in the sense that I feel like Barbara is somebody who shifted the conversation of yoga practice and yoga classes at an earlier time before what's happening now. And I think of her as kind of like a canary in the coal mine, maybe, or something. And we talk about that in the podcast. And I know her from my friend Ryan Cunningham from Unrolled Podcast. And we talk about that also. Such an interesting conversation about how yoga has come about in the way that we know it today. And we will be listening to it in a moment. Before we do, let me drop some of my stuff. I'm going to be in London at Tri Yoga Camden January 12th through 14th. And I am now also going to be in Switzerland January 20th through 22nd. This got added to that trip. I'm going to go to Switzerland and be in Nidau and Bern, Switzerland, January 20th through 22nd. I'm also going to be in Armonk, New York, February 3rd at Sage and the Flying Buddha. And I'm going to be at Triangle Yoga in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, February 16th through 18th. You can find out about those events and listen to the archives of this podcast and read that blog from last week and find my online yoga video stuff. Let me remind you that you've got till the end of the year to get 20% off of your practice DVD download or online workshop, Gentle is the New Advanced purchases. All you got to do is use promo code HOLIDAY20 for 20% off. Again, that's promo code HOLIDAY20 for 20% off of your practice DVD download and online workshop purchases. Also, you can still get in on the live stream subscription. So, you can find out about all of that stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Also, showing support for the podcast is a really lovely thing to do. You could go to iTunes, write a review and give us some stars, or you could go to a blog or podcast page and make a direct donation. That'd be greatly appreciated. What else? Let me also just say quickly, those of you who were listening last week, I got an email. If you were concerned about me divulging that personal information about my marital affairs, not to worry. Let me just assure everyone, my wife knows that I do that stuff. I told her. She's fine with it. It's okay, really, I promise. But I appreciate your concern and your emails, as always. I really love it when you reach out. Please feel welcome to do that. Let me also just mention about today's talk. Barbara and I ran into just a bit of technical difficulties, and we were like on plan C. So there's some technical issues with the recording. You can hear it just fine, but my apologies for the lack of audio quality. We did the best we could. Okay. As I said, I'm not really feeling like I want to talk too much today. I'm going to keep it short, and I think maybe we'll just get to our talk with Barbara. I will touch base with you on the other side and let you know about who's coming on. We're finishing out the year, and we are approaching our 100th episode, so we can touch base about that on the other side some maybe. But let's go ahead and get to this talk. Let's listen to Barbara Benagh.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So, can you hear me all right? I'm not sure which is... I didn't even know earbuds had microphone.
Well, listen, I'm getting a pretty good signal, and I can hear you pretty good. If you can hear me okay.
Oh, good. Yeah, I can.
Then I think we're pretty good to go.
Right.
All right. Well, it's kind of wonderfully appropriate that we struggled with the technology so much. I mean, again, for me, first of all, thanks for giving me your time and struggling with it to make this happen. I really appreciate it, getting this chance to talk to you today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. And, it's just, for me, you're like an example of a model in the yoga world or yoga teachers. And like I said, the fact that we struggled with the technology, or that you haven't been on Skype in a really long time, or you don't spend much time on your computer as much as some of the younger folks do, that makes sense. I almost feel like, really, to do this conversation real justice, I wish we were in the same room,
It would be great. I mean, I have started texting.
Well, there you go. I did have some texts with you, but eventually I was like, let's just get on the phone together. But
that's exactly where I was at. It was like, enough of this.
I know. Sometimes the technology helps and sometimes it doesn't, right?
Right.
Well, in any case, it is great to speak with you. You know, you've come up on the podcast a number of times. We have a mutual friend in Ryan Cunningham. That's where I first heard about you. And then also I had Justine from Down Under Yoga on the podcast, and you came up in that conversation too. And what I've discovered is like anybody who's like spent any time in the Boston yoga scene totally knows who you are. But outside of that, not as much.
Right, well, that's true. But though I have traveled around and taught here and there. I just haven't done a lot of it. I was a single parent, and I didn't have the luxury of, sort of going on the circuit, as you could call it. I just, and to tell you the truth, it's interesting. I've talked about this with other yoga teachers, and it's always been a surprise to me. People who prefer to travel, and they love that whole workshop energy, and I prefer seeing the same people every week and knowing that it's just a conversation and we'll be back next week. And so I stopped traveling to teach, except for a couple of things I do a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first thing I gave up was the travel.
Well, I can understand. I've been kind of hunkered down for the last 10 years. I know you had a center for like 24 years. I had one for 10. And
Right.
So now I'm kind of going out and doing some travel. And right now it feels kind of fun, you know, to go out and see what's happening in other places and meet new people. But I do have 2 small children also. And I could see, I was like a starving musician before I was a yoga teacher. And I don't know that I want to be out on the road. You know, that's like a lifestyle that's not always conducive to your yoga.
I know when I look at someone like Doug Keller and look at his schedule, it's just like, how do you do it? But he thrives on it.
Mm-hmm.
He just thrives on it.
Well, I read this thing that was on your website. It said, just enough students who like my quirky style to make teaching yoga my profession as well as my calling. And
yes,
I thought that was interesting. Like just enough students,
right?
Like not as many followers as possible, but like just enough.
Mm-hmm. I've always had that. It's like, I remember my accountant when I first was setting up my school, and he said, this is never going to fly because, we're going back a long ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I'll just be the starving artist then. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I got in at the right time. Let's put it that way.
Well, let's talk about that. I know I was looking at some dates here. It was like you moved back to Boston and opened a studio in 1980. And I'm like...
78.
78. That's right. And so I've been like trying to think back, and I've had folks on the podcast who were doing yoga around that time. And it seems like it was such a different time. And that's not even when you started. Like that's when you landed. Like...
Right.
When do you first ever coming into contact with yoga? When do you remember that happened?
1972.
That's the year I was born. So when...
Well, there you
go. So where do you come into contact with yoga in 1972? That's the hippie time. That's coming out of the Woodstock and stuff. Right?
I was a straight up hippie.
Yeah.
I moved to England because of the war in Vietnam.
Oh, you left because of that.
I left the United States, maybe to never come back, and probably my British husband wanted he wanted to work in America. So after 8 years, off we came back to America. But
I'm thinking I need to move out of America right now. Shit's
right. Oh, please.
It's crazy. It seems like a comparable situation where like things in the country are like just really screwed up.
I know. And it's every day. It's like, can it get worse? Yes. Every day it gets worse. It's shockingly shocking. But when I went over there, my husband was he wasn't my husband at that point. He was working on a PhD in Birmingham, England. And, I was running a health food store, and I was just, Serious.
Where were you running a health food store? Where was
In
that?
downtown Birmingham, England.
Mm-hmm.
Is it was a dump at that time. I hear it's improved greatly, but it's where he was going to school, and I was just so out of shape because I've always been an athletic person. Before I found yoga, I danced and I rode a bike and I've always enjoyed. I ran track. I've always enjoyed athletics. And so when I started getting stiff, I started really feeling bad about it. But because I was a hippie, I was mostly just lying around being a hippie. And
So wait, what was the yoga like back then? You were just like at a concert and like doing it, or like there wasn't
no,
like yoga centers and classes, were there?
there weren't classes there. Well, there were, but I went to sign up. In England, they have a pretty extensive adult, or at this time, an extensive adult education program. And there was I just wanted to take like a dance class or some exercise class, and all they had was yoga. And I'm like, I am not doing yoga. It's just like weird. And luckily, the teacher, a woman named Elizabeth Keeble, she was teaching Iyengar yoga. I didn't know anything about yoga other than I didn't want to do it, and she was so down to earth and normal. And then when we left Birmingham after David was to school and went back to London, um, I go, okay, I like that yoga. And I went into this yoga class, and it was, the room was filled with incense smoke, and everybody was, and I was like, if this had been the first yoga class I ever went to, I would have never gone back. So I was so blessed to meet Elizabeth, and she was a wonderful teacher.
And she got you going, and it was sort of straight up Iyengar method.
It was, and that's all I knew. And I did that for about 13 years. When I first came back to the States in 78, I was still very much in the Iyengar camp, but it didn't last that much longer. Out of 40 plus years teaching, 13 of them were Iyengar. So
I see. And did you start teaching in the UK before you came back?
I did.
And how did that happen? Did you do a formal 200-hour training? I'm kidding, of course.
They have that, but no. But wait, I did a teacher training exam, I guess, where we had to have people come in off the street, and we had to teach a few poses, and I failed. And the reason I failed was because I didn't understand that beginners are stupid. And that was maybe the first inkling that this wasn't going to really work out for me. That attitude that these people are stupid. It stuck with me all those years.
I came up against that some. I think it may have changed, but I know that my first early experiences with Iyengar method, there was a pretty strict level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. And you had to be able to demonstrate certain things to be able to do level 2 or level 3.
Right. And hold poses a certain amount of time.
Yeah, and I was an outsider. Like I had learned Iyengar, but not through the Iyengar Center so much. And then like I could do level 3 poses, but I hadn't come up through the ranks and proved it yet.
Right.
So there was just all kinds of stuff like that. So I know what you mean. I think there was always exceptions. There was always teachers within any tradition that weren't so stuck to it. But the method in and of itself did feel to me like, I don't know, it was pretty hard-edged. And like you said, the teachers would often be kind of mean.
Yes, and that's something in myself. When I got back to London, Elizabeth had told me when I called her and I said, "Help, help! I'm in an incense-filled room." She sent me to Penny Neal Smith, who was a wonderful teacher, and she would always arrive like 10 minutes late from class, breathless on her bicycle, and would make us hold these poses and lecture us about peace marches and vegetarianism. But she was a wonderful person, and she taught that method. But she was very supportive of me, and then she sent me to Kofi Busia. He whipped me into shape.
I read about that though. I read that when you studied with Penny, she kind of taught you like a same sequence for a while.
She taught the same. In this regard, it'd be sort of like doing the primary series.
Well,
It's
yeah.
the same sequence, or the Bikram series. She taught the very same poses every single class, and she had the people. Her classes were full. There'd be 40 people in there, And this is 1972 or 1973. That was a big class, and she'd have people who'd been there before stand in the front row. And so that the people standing behind had a guide. And that was something that I used for years and years and years, back when I had beginners classes. There are no beginners classes anymore. Nobody wants to be a beginner.
Well, it's funny, and that's why I bring it up, because I do that. I teach the same sequence, and the biggest criticism I get is that I don't come up with a new thing. And I could, but at some point it was a choice I made, especially in a group class context, to have a consistent thing that people could learn, so they weren't always having to learn new choreography. Because I see these group classes as like to establish foundations or reinforce them with people, and then from there it needs to be more of an individual thing.
Right.
So it seems like you had that kind of time where you had a set sequence, but at some point you wanted more than that, and that's when she said, "Go see Kopi."
Well, the class was in a library, and I would sneak between the stacks because I bought the Light on Yoga book, and I'd go between the stacks and I'd look in the book, and there'd be, okay, there's a handstand, and so she saw me doing this, and at some point she goes, "You've moved beyond my class," and he was in Oxford, and I would take the train down about every 6 weeks or so and spend the weekend. He would do these weekend intensive things, and he's hardcore.
Well, I came in contact with him a few times because I had some stints as a core faculty instructor at Omega Institute, and he would pass through there. He does like annual trips there. So I've come in contact. I didn't study with him, but yeah, he seemed pretty hardcore.
He is. You'd have to maybe pay me a lot of money to take a class with him now. I just don't want that. I went to a 3-week intensive with him, and I would wake up in the morning crying because I didn't want to do it because it hurt so badly. But I was in a class. There was this wonderful teacher from the Boston area named Peter Dolan, and we were doing some god awful backbend, and Kofi's working on Peter, and Peter goes, "Stop! I'll tell you where the money is."
See, but
and it was like, how could he keep his sense of humor?
I mean, we're laughing about it now, but there's a lot of reevaluating going on,
Yes.
And what you're describing was the convention. Like, that's what Iyengar was, the predominant approach. It was considered the gold standard when it came to teachers.
And a man was clearly a genius.
In what regard? How do you?
I think in his ability to understand the way the body moves. And also, to give them credit, I did walk away from it, and I've managed to stay very close friends with several, still very active Iyengar teachers. And my Jamaica trip is with John Schumacher, who's hardcore Iyengar. But he mellows out in Jamaica just for me. And my students say that I harden up because of him. Anyway, what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
No, I'm jumping all over you. But the reason I'm doing it is because I've had people on the podcast before who are of more your generation, and when they talk about their studies with Mr. Iyengar, it does seem like it evolved over time, and people who studied Iyengar at an earlier time did get a different experience than people who go to classes today. Well, I was going to say, as things have gotten passed down over the years, like even Judith Hansen-Laster was on, she talked about that things were much more, there was less rules of sorts, and they did like flowing practices with Mr. Iyengar.
Oh yeah, we called them jumpings.
Yeah, like there was times when they did vinyasa with Mr. Iyengar, and nowadays when people think of vinyasa, it's like a completely separate thing than Iyengar.
It is. And do you know if they even, they probably wouldn't call them jumpings anymore because they have to use the right terminology, because, they caught a lot of flack from people that, they're all about the physical And I can't speak for everybody, obviously, who does that practice. When I started, I just wanted the physical. But people I've known who've done that practice for many years are, have very deep spiritual life. And as I was going to say, if I had walked into that place filled with smoke, I never would have come back. But I was in a place of having really kind of just turned into a couch potato for a few years. And I needed that little push in the butt to get me going. And so for a few years, it actually motivated me. And the difficulty of it, what sort of brought back some of my memories of the athletics that I like. But what I've done now, I still like athletics, but I'd rather do it by riding a bike 10 miles than beating myself up on my mat.
Well, that's the thing. I agree. I think if you want, I'm discovering that too. Like, I'm wanting things for my body, and I think they're better had it in other places, like going for a run or pulling on a pull-up bar rather than trying to make my yoga practice everything.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. But maybe we have to come to that. And, my friend John Schumacher, he said to me once that I think it was the first time, maybe it's the second time I went to Greece to study with Angela Farmer, who's the most influential teacher I've ever had.
Well, I was going to get there. I wanted to get your Iyengar background first because I know she's another influence and quite a swing in another direction, it seems.
A big swing. But I sent John a postcard from Greece back when you used to do that before the internet. And he said when I got back to the States, he said he could tell by that postcard that I was out the door.
Well, I'm intrigued still by like this time of Iyengar and specifically, you said he was a genius, and I agree with that. But what he's a genius for, I think, is in his ability to communicate what he was doing as a yoga teacher and to spread a lot of good. Because I know a lot of people, including myself, certainly gotten a lot of benefit from that system of practice.
Yes.
But at the same time, there's all these things, and I talked with Judith about this as well. There's all these things that I was taught in terms of classical alignment and like hyperextended elbows and like all this stuff that like I would not teach anymore. So it does seem like some of the alignment cues, like the arbitrary alignment cues being given to everybody in the room all at the same time, has been proven problematic over time. Wouldn't you agree?
I do agree. And I also don't find much value in everybody stopping and going and having a look at one student doing something that your body may be in a completely different place for. And really that's sort of what shifted me was that when I was asked, another thing that worked in my favor, to be realistic about this, is I happen to be able to do a lot of the back bends. I'm a back bender. I've given up most of my back bends for, I love back bends, but I've given up a lot of them really for my nervous system. I feel there's a time and a place for them, but I could do all so when everything is geared towards the external expression, well, the people who are going to get the most strokes and the most compliments, and this is why when I left, getting back to where we were when I started teaching in 1972, I'd not even been doing yoga a year. And the teacher, who was this is an interesting story, a wonderful woman named Vera Saida. And when she decided to retire, because she was like 80 or 70, and she'd started doing yoga when she was 60. But when she said she was going to leave, everybody in the class said, "Oh, well, Barbara can teach us because she can do all the poses." And, in hindsight, it's like, what a terrible.
Well, the same thing happened to me. I could do poses, and everybody assumed that meant advanced, and then you could teach because you could do these poses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like, no. But I didn't know that 1 year into practicing yoga at all. So it was, but I went.
So you jumped into teaching without doing like formal Iyengar training for 2 years or whatever?
There was no real formal Iyengar training. When
Yeah.
I went to India in 1981, they were handing out certificates like candy.
They're like, go be Iyengar teachers. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I still have mine.
Yeah.
I ran into it when I was packing up to move from Boston. It was like, oh my gosh. It was hand drawn and my name and calligraphy and his signature and everything.
Yeah. And so you were just, I'm sure. Oh, and that other thing you said about everybody look at the student. I remember the last time that happened to me where I was asked to be that student that everybody looked at. And in the moment, I got applause. But on the way home, I was miserable. I was like, I could do that thing in class, but I had all other kinds of problems that you couldn't see. Like just because you could do the handstand press, who fucking cares?
Right. And,
Yeah.
and that's what happened to me. When it's like I could do all these back bends. And so there was a teacher who was putting together a book that never got published, but it was going to be of it actually, the photographs are extraordinarily beautiful, but it was this really good photographer. But what she was going to do, she took photographs of bodies. You wouldn't actually see the pose. Like there's a picture of Patricia Walden in Supta Virasana, and all you see is she's lying on her back, of course, and you see the bottom of her ribs and the top of her pelvic rim. And when you don't see it with a whole body attached to it, it's like two little mountains, or are we looking at the Himalayas or something? It was beautiful. But I did this Kapotasana, and this was back in the days of where you looked at a Polaroid, no digital, and
Yeah,
I
nobody
looked.
had phones that they could just snap shit on and put
No,
it on
no, no.
Instagram.
A photo shoot was a killer back in that day.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at this photograph and I said, that photograph could go in a textbook. It's that good. The form is that good. And yet I'd just done it. And it felt awful.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was because I knew my picture was being taken. But part of it, most of it, was just this, like almost like a light bulb went off. It was like, it doesn't feel like this photograph is a lie. It's fake news. It promises something that looks good but feels bad. And so when Angela came along, a long time after that, and was able to get into that, so if we use the pose as just the vehicle to get into what's inside, which you can't do that mentally. You have to have somebody as gifted as her to sort of seduce you into it. And then it's like, whoa, I'm not going back from this.
So how did that happen? You're describing this moment where you realize, it's the same moment for me where you realize, oh, I can accomplish these forms, but I don't think that really means anything other than I can accomplish these forms.
Right.
And then you're wondering, so you're still teaching, as was I. You're still teaching the same stuff. So how do you find your way to Angela? When do you first discover her? How does she come into your sphere?
Well, I knew Angela in London.
Oh.
I didn't know her very well, but I went to class with her a few times. I didn't know about her until I was getting ready to leave. But she was still an Iyengar teacher then. So she didn't stand out as anything special.
See, that's so interesting to me because when I think of her now, I don't know a lot about her. I'd love to get her on. I've tried to reach out to her. Maybe you can help me. But
well, you should have called. She was here 3 weeks ago.
Oh, well, anyways, I think she's so intriguing. And what I know of her is so far the other direction. I think of animals and nature and somatic experience. And
she is.
And so she too, like you, was an Iyengar teacher. And when you met her, she wasn't doing all that stuff.
Right. And when I moved to Boston, because I asked her, I said, we're moving to Boston and, do you know anybody doing yoga in Boston? She goes, I went to Boston once. I would stay away from all of those people.
Oh, no.
But, the truth of the matter is the people that I met, because there were only 3 or 4 yoga teachers, for goodness sake, were all wonderfully welcoming to me. And as soon as they saw me practicing, they realized that, because by that time I'd been doing it 6 years, and so had they, so
Well, it's interesting to me because it was such a smaller world.
Oh yeah, I knew everybody who did yoga.
But because of that, it seems to me like it was less about business. And if somebody showed up, I just remember I showed up to classes with a genuine heart desire to learn, and I was passionate, and like teachers responded to that, like it was recognized if you were really committed. That's how you
Right.
became a teacher. You were committed enough. You showed up consistently enough for a
Right.
year or whatever.
Right. Well, when they met me and saw me practice, then they were willing to, have me sub here and there. And my very first class in Boston was at the Bank of Boston, which is now Bank of America, up like on their top floor. And this was even before the days of, there being any sort of workout rooms in big corporations. But so we had just some a conference room carpeted. But I had that class. I bet I taught that class for 10 years. And I got met some wonderful people there who then migrated over to my studio on Beacon Hill and stayed. And one of them became a full-time yoga teacher. She quit being a banker.
So that's right. You opened a studio in like 1980. You said in Beacon Hill, and it was pretty small. Like I remember Ryan describing like trying to find it, and then having to like search for it and finding it being like this secret, and then like bringing friends there.
Right, because it was in a historic building. It used to be the jail, and so it was on the historic register. And Beacon Hill, I don't know if you're familiar with Beacon Hill in Boston. It's the oldest part of, that Charlestown where, all the revolution and everything. And so everything is, really old. And so you can't put a sign on your front door, for example, without jumping through tremendous hoops. And there would be no point because they're not going to let you put a sign on your door. And so you had to actually be looking for me to find me.
That's what he was saying. He had to like search you out, which is that's what I've always said. In the old days, you couldn't just drop in. You had to find a teacher and convince them you were worthy.
And then we were up on the third floor. And I would have I might even still be there. I probably would, and I would be here now, but I would have never given it up if they hadn't decided to change the use of the building and evicted me.
After what, 24 years or something like that?
Yeah. Well, the first 2 or 3 years I had a studio on Beacon Hill on Charles Street where I lived. And then I expanded. Well, actually,
see, I think that's what Ryan was talking about when you were teaching.
No, he wasn't in that place.
Oh, okay, all right.
Oh no! I'll tell you where he went. So, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. So when I lost my lease, I'd actually that place I'd found because I was looking for a place to hold a workshop, and I'd been to community meetings there, and I knew there was a big room, and they were showing me the building, and on this door there was a sign. Does anyone know how we could use this room? And when she opened the door, I said, "Whoa, here's my yoga studio." And I think I was there for 13 years. Okay. And then I went nomadic, and we found a space in an acupuncture school, and then the owner of that got very ill and they had to close it. Then I was renting by the hour at the YWCA. We're talking about this 10 years ago.
Yeah.
At the YWCA, and what is it? Alcoholics Anonymous. They all smoke, and they'd be waiting to use the room, and they'd be up there smoking desperately, and you just go, "Oh man!" But you know what? People followed me around, and then finally, this place 5 minutes from my house. I would go in there to get the occasional facial or something, and I knew the owner pretty well, and she goes, you should use my studio. She had put in a yoga studio. Baptiste opened next door without her, within 6 months, and so that just killed her. But it didn't kill me, and that's where I met Ryan. I remember meeting Ryan because he came from New York and from Cindy, and I knew Cindy and had taught at at there several times, and so. I was, I noticed him right away, and because we had, a memory thing. But that also, you had to be inside the building before you saw the sign.
saying. It was like more low key, but it was such a different flavor. And so, all right, but I know that you had
And then
already.
Justine Cohen came calling.
Yes, well, we'll get there. That didn't happen.
But that came after from Ryan when Ryan was finding me on in Brookline Village.
That's
Then
right. That's
then I
right.
went off to, and that's where I've been for the last 7 years.
Well, what I'm curious now is that, I know when Ryan met you, you weren't an Iyengar teacher then.
Oh
So,
no, it had been a long time, long.
yeah, you had already made that transition. So I'm interested to hear more about that transition and how that happened. So when does Angela start to come back into your spirit and she's doing something different now?
Yeah, yes. Um, you know, I think she once said that when she was something like 6 years old, she would have, I can't remember how she said it at all, but the gist of it was that she was intrigued with how the body can move. And she said she tried things like dance and other sort of, more obscure kind of body movement, uh, that has been around forever, different exercise things. And she goes, it wasn't until she went to a yoga class, and I have to assume it was an Iyengar class, but I couldn't swear to it. And she said that it was like, okay, this is the way. And she got into doing that. And then she said she felt like there was, when it was sort of like, I'm going to climb this mountain to get this pose. And then when you got to the top, instead of them letting you fly the flag of your country at the top of the mountain, they were like, oh, wait a minute. Look, it goes higher. She
Mm-hmm.
says there was never any place where you could stop and be at peace with where you were. You had to keep on going.
Yep, the dangling carrot, I call it. Like it's right there, you
Yeah,
reach for it and it
right,
just gets pulled away.
right. And it keeps going and going. So I don't know. I think that as she also matured, because like she's like maybe 7 or 8 years older than me, that as she matured, and I consider, when people have asked me this in the past, and I think that other teachers of my generation would say the same, coming out of that Iyengar mold, that there were a handful of teachers, and it would have been Angela Farmer and Victor von Koten and Donna Holloman, who were considered to be like, all right, they're not that much older than us in chronological terms, but they are who we would go to study with. Because there was not really anyone in the States yet who was. There were people like Mary Dunn's mother, I forget her name. They were starting doing Iyengar yoga, but it was the European people. And when I came to the States, I invited Angela a few times. And then when Angela and Victor became a couple, and there was another teacher in Boston who would bring in Victor. And Victor von Koten is just a remarkably wonderful man. And talk about an iconoclast. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I don't know much about him.
Oh,
Had you met him earlier, like when you met Angela earlier, or when?
no, I had met him in Boston when this teacher, Karen Steffen, would bring him in. And he was he still is an amazing, wonderful man, and just does the best physical assists, which I really don't do. Physical assists, I'd trust him. I just say, do with me what you wish. He's big, he's like 6'3", and he's a big guy. Think Eric Schiffman size.
That's right.
And just a bear of a guy, but so sweet. And so then when they became a couple, that created a huge kerfuffle in the Iyengar community. And as a result, they were sort of ostracized. So
Why? Why was that a kerfuffle? Like you're not supposed to.
Because Iyengar was very fond of Anamika, Victor's wife.
I see. So there was a bad beef.
Yes. So, and I don't know what the whole story behind, all I know is that they ended up together and they're together still after all these years, and they're married and happy.
Right.
But going from having 100 people in a gymnasium to having 10 people in the living room of a student. I felt so bad for them. And I felt embarrassed for people who treated them, especially Victor, because she was out of the fold. But that was part of the problem. That maybe even was more of the problem, was that she was an apostate.
That's really interesting to see that. That must have been kind of formative to watch that go down. Yeah.
Right. But I went to this this class one evening, this one that had 10 people in the room, and it was just, we didn't do much. But I remember walking out to my car and saying, I've never felt like this after a yoga class in my entire life, but I want to feel like this more. So this is what I'm going to do. And so I was already out the door with Iyengar yoga at that point in time. I stayed around for a while, but I knew I was sort of, what am I going to do now? Go work in a bookstore or something?
Right. You're already at it for so many years.
Yeah. And then the 13 years at that point, and it's like, what am I going to do? I don't, because I'm not doing this anymore. And then Angela shows up and kind of blew my mind. And so off I went to Greece, dragged my sister along, and we had a great time. And I went back there several times, and I brought her and Victor to Boston many times. And as I said, I just saw her 3 weeks ago in Chapel Hill here, and it was lovely.
So what are some of the things that she started doing when she felt licensed, and then you seemed to follow suit after you decided, okay, I don't have to be stuck in a Iyengar, which I think is very interesting because you talked about seeing that picture and how it looked and how it felt.
Yeah.
And I had the same experience. As soon as how I felt became the determiner of my practice, it started to look real different.
Right. Yeah. Because when I first, of course there had to be, I'd be lying over a bolster and, wriggling around like Angela, and I go, Patricia's over in Cambridge doing 108 dropbacks today. And so I was beating up on myself, and despite choosing to walk away from it, I was still using that as the yardstick. That what am I going to lose? Also, I was also the arm balance queen. And so I'm like, all right, I'm probably not going to be able to do the arm balances. But as long as I said, the pose has to feel like what is, was increasingly a familiar experience of, let me think of the word I want, of just a focus of where I was. If I started to lose that, if it didn't feel like I wanted it to feel, which was not, I wouldn't want people to think that means it has to always feel good, because sometimes you have to sometimes you definitely have to go through some of the bardo sort of to work your way.
I always think of it as stira sukha, that there's like a certain sense of presence and balance to the effort.
Right. And when you've lost that, then the pose, and that's what I say in class. So, you can have a pose being timed, say, let's hold this pose for 5 minutes. But if by 3 minutes in, you're trembling and shaking and you can't keep a steady breath and you're not even really quite sure what's going on besides the intensity of having to hold this pose, then your pose is actually already over. And I think that's when most injuries happen. When people have been, when they've been, pushed to do something. But I think that one of the, it's a misconception, and I think it certainly was Iyengar's viewpoint, that if you don't keep pushing at people, then they're inherently lazy.
Yes, and that's it. As hard as you can, or you're lazy.
Right. And it was like that's once you know what tapas is, you're kind of good to go. It's passion. You don't have to have somebody whipping you to get you to do the poses. You want to do the poses. It's great. And so you don't have, I needed it in the beginning, the discipline of that practice. But there was a point where, it's just like, I don't need to be yelled at again.
Yes, you see, to me, what I'm getting from you is that one of the big switches, which is what's true for me, is that there's a certain permission granted in class.
Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
you don't have to push that hard. That this idea that getting farther means pushing your body more.
Right.
We just throw that out. And if you decide before you start that it's not about pushing your body as hard as you can, that means it gets to be about other things.
Right. And you asked me about the first thing that really took hold with me, with Angela, was her attention to breathing. Because in the Iyengar system, you keep pranayama as a separate practice.
That's right. I remember someone telling me not to do ujjayi in class, in a Iyengar class. It was just natural belly breath. And then after you were done doing your asana, you did pranayama like as a totally separate thing, like on your way to meditation.
Yeah. Yes, and that's what they do. And I had a guy in Jamaica an Iyengar student, who said the ujjayi breathing is it's a distraction from my practice. And I said that to me that seems like.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.